Good afternoon. My name is Mehdi Shadmer, and I'm an associate professor of public policy here at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm happy to be with you today with an excellent panel. Our moderator is Rastin Zarkor. Rastin is the Middle East and Islamic Studies librarian at UNC Libraries, where he curates vernacular language material from the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. He's also a PhD candidate in Middle Eastern Islamic Studies at New York University. His research focuses on Russian and Iranian imperial state formation and mobility in the Caspian Sea. I will leave the introduction of Professor Ziad to his and his excellent book to Rastin. During the panel discussion, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post your questions. Rastin will address as many questions as possible. Before we begin, I would like to thank UNC Persian Studies, Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, Center for the Middle East and Islamic Studies, as well as UNC Central Asia Working Group. And these have co-sponsored and made this event possible. I would also like to thank Professor Claudia Yaqub, who has been organizing these panels. Rastin, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction, Mehdi. It's a pleasure to see everyone today. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, my friend and colleague, Dr. Walid Ziad. Walid Ziad is the assistant professor and Ali Jarrahi fellow in Persian studies in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to this, Ziad was a research scholar in law and an Islamic law and civilization research fellow at the Kamel Center at Yale Law School. At the intersection of social history, religious studies, and anthropology, Ziad's research centers on religious networks and institutions in the Persian world, Afghanistan, South and Central Asia, and Iran, spanning late antiquity to the present. In this endeavor, he has conducted fieldwork on historical and contemporary Muslim mysticism and revival and material culture in over 120 towns across Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan. He received his PhD with distinction in history at Yale University. His dissertation is entitled Traversing the Indus and the Oxus, Trans-Regional Islamic Revival in the Age of Political Fragmentation and the Great Game, 1747 to 1880, and was awarded a university-wide prize, the Theron Rockwell Field Prize, and is one of the two most prestigious Yale dissertation awards. His forthcoming publications include Hidden Caliphate, Sufi Saints Beyond the Oxus and Indus, which is a Harvard University Press book coming out in 2021. I just recently saw a copy, so congratulations, Walid. The next book is Beyond the Khutbah and Sikha, Sovereignty and Coinage in Sindh, 1300 to 1700, which is under review. Sufi Masters of the Afghan Empire, Bibi Sahiba and Her Sacred Network, which is in progress. And that book is on female sainthood in the Persian world. And the book that he will be talking about today is called In the Treasure Room of the Sakra King, the Native Copper Coinage of Northern Gandhara, circa 550 to 1100. And that's by the American Numismatic Society, and it came out this year. Ziad's articles on historical and ideological trends in the Muslim world have appeared in New York Times, International Herald Tribune, The Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, Christian Science Monitor, The Hill, and major dailies international. So he's a pretty well-written scholar. So we're excited to have this conversation with him today. And for our audience today, we will have the way that the format will work today is Walid will give a presentation for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then I will respond with some questions, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A. And as Mehdi had said before, please feel free to write any questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and I'll be sure to get to them as I can at the end of the session. So I want to thank all of you once again for joining us today, and I will give the floor to Dr. Ziad. Thank you.
Rastin John, thank you so much for that really generous introduction. And of course to Mehdi John and Claudia John, thank you so much for putting this together. It really is an honor to be invited here for this opportunity to introduce my book on the Iranian borderlands in late antiquity. My new book, which will, COVID permitting, be out hopefully in February, fingers crossed, in the treasure room of the Saqqara King, votive coinage from Gandharan shrines, looks at some newly discovered coins, seals, and related artifacts to reinterpret the history and iconographic landscape of Afghanistan and Pakistan from the 6th to the 11th centuries. And I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Also hoping to convince you by the end of this presentation that there's nothing more important than coins, so all of our fields should actually head in that direction. Now, our story takes place in a lush valley within the Saqqara Peak in northwestern Pakistan. In the tribal areas towards the Afghan border, you can see the peak in the distance in this photograph, where there's a vast limestone temple complex. It's a cave temple complex, part of an ancient Hindu, much larger actually, complex of sacred sites. For over 700 years, from the 4th century to about the 12th century, this cluster of shrines produced hundreds of varieties of their own coinage, issued as religious offerings for pilgrims, which is a unique case in the broader Iranian world and in South and Central Asia. These were absolutely minuscule copper coins. The ones you're looking at right now are about yay big, 0.5 grams in weight, featuring eclectic and seemingly bizarre combinations of Iranian, Greco-Roman, Indic, and Islamic iconography. These coins practically blur the boundaries between coins as monetary instruments, coins as political or religious proclamations, as propaganda, and what is really simply vernacular folk art, providing a window in what may have been an ecclesiastic administration, for want of a better term, let's call it a shrine state, with varying degrees of autonomy throughout its lifetime. And although seemingly insignificant, notoriously difficult to make sense of, these minuscule coins actually overturn our understanding of cultural and artistic exchange, of the way in which religious symbols emerged, transformed, disappeared, were reworked, in one of the most fascinating examples of regional transculturation. They feature 5 different scripts: Pahlavi or Middle Persian, Bactrian Greek, the Indic, Brahmi, and Sharada scripts, and Kufic Arabic. Iranian sacred animals are juxtaposed with Vishnu's conch, Shiva's trident, and swastikas. If you just look at what you have in front of you right now, we've got Vishnu's chakra, the swastika, the ubiquitous auspicious symbol. To those familiar with the Iranian world, you'll recognize, if your imagination can actually make out what's going on there, this composite creature with the face of a lion, wings of a bird, scales, I believe the tongue of a snake, which actually carries the royal charisma in the broader Iranian world. If you move a little bit further, you'll find Vishnu's conch, and then these 3 images towards the bottom, the Pegasus, the winged ram, and the peacock are all familiar carriers of divine charisma or royal charisma. And towards the bottom right, you'll see a human representation of Adur, or Atar, the holy fire in Zoroastrianism. We find lots and lots of different Zoroastrian fire altars. Here are 4 of dozens that show up in these little coins, plus a host of astrological and devotional symbols, the ones you just encountered a moment ago. In certain cases, we find ancient Greek portraits and motifs. In this case, this little copper coin at the bottom from about the 4th century CE imitates a 500-year-older Indo-Greek coin of the famous King Menander, who had converted to Buddhism in about 150, 160 BC. In one case, we actually have the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who shows up holding Shiva's trident. And these are the 2 copper coins on the side. I have also included this gold plaque in between because I realize how difficult it is for most people to actually make sense of what's going on with regards to the 2 coins to the right. And in yet another series, older Hindu and Iranian motifs appear next to coins inscribed with Allah and La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, the Muslim proclamation of faith. This book relates the remarkable story of these coins and the sacred sites which made them, and introduces the obscured history of one of the most neglected yet formative years of this region's history, which is now Pakistan, Afghanistan, and its neighbors. I tell the story of four great kingdoms, sort of each one gets a separate chapter. Three of them don't even show up in the history books. These are the Nizak Shahi, the Turk Shahi, or the Shahis of Ohind, more commonly known as the Hindu Shahis. And then the fourth is the Ghaznavids, who are much better known to, again, those in the field. And these are the great states of the Iranian borderlands, ruling over the legendary kingdoms known as Zabul, which is now around modern-day Kandahar, which is southeastern Afghanistan, Kabul, and Gandhara, which is now in northwestern Pakistan, spilling into Afghanistan. So let me start by situating us in the world of the Afghanistan-Pakistan frontier and sharing a story that I love to tell. Now, I realize this is a world that few of us will be really familiar with, so bear with me here. There are a few markers. This town that you see, Tafsasila, on the bottom right-hand side, now called Taxila, was one of the great sort of centers of Buddhist learning, not far from Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan now. Shift a little bit to the left, where Gandhara is labeled, you'll find Purushapura, which is the modern-day city of Peshawar on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Head into the Khyber Pass, and you'll find yourself in Jalalabad and eventually in Kabul, which are right off of this map. So with that, between Kabul and Islamabad is this ancient country of Gandhara, which features, as I just said, the Khyber Pass, through which most travelers and armies from Iran and Central Asia entered into India. And of course, the Hindu Kush mountain range. And several great Buddhist centers of learning, such as Peshawar and Taxila that you saw on the map, and the kingdom of Swat, which lies to the north. This is really where Buddhism came of age. As a crossroads of civilization, Gandhara has been the blending point of Indic, Turkic, and Iranian worlds. It's, the way I look at it, it's a veritable petri dish for observing the interactions between faiths and cultures. And I'm going to demonstrate this through a few coins circulating in and around Gandhara. Now, not to confuse you, these are not coins that were specifically minted in the sacred sites we're looking at, but these are coins that circulated throughout this belt, and they've often been found also in the region that in the exact region we're discussing. All right, let's begin with this. This is an 8th century trilingual coin of a king who interestingly styles himself Khorasan Tegin Shah. And the title is quite fascinating because Khorasan, place of where the sun rises, sort of implying the east, meets the word Tegin, which is a Turkish military title. And then you've got the Persian title Shah, meaning, of course, king. The reverse features Adur, which is as I said, the human representation of the sacred fire in Zoroastrian traditions, something that becomes very popular in the Gandhara region to actually depict in its own form. But the king on this coin actually follows a blend of Hinduism and Buddhism. And his crown features, in fact, 3 tridents. And he's got a little lion's head at the top of his crown. Incidentally, the dynasty to which this king belonged, which ruled over much of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and if you can catch this on the map, the Turk Shahis of Zabul Rahaj in the center, the Turk Shahis of Kapisa Gandhara, these are 2 lobes of a huge empire that covered this landmass. These Turk Shahi kings also founded the city of Kabul and held off Arab invasions for about 150 years, while all the adjacent lands had been conquered. It's a fascinating story I tell in my book of Arab armies sort of desperately coming in every few years, taking the big cities and unable to hold them for more than a few months or a couple of years when the local armies sweep back in and throw them out. Here's another rather interesting coin, which belongs to a forgotten 6th century kingdom, the Nizak Shahis, spanning Zabul, Kabul, and Gandhara. What we see here is a Sasanian-esque Persian-style bust, but with a nice mustache. And then we also see some cranial deformation on the bust, which is a result of the Central Asian practice of head binding at birth. And as you'll notice, the king wears the bull's head crown. And this, believe it or not, may be one of the several historical figures who inspired the character of Rustam in the Persian epic Book of Kings, the Shahnameh. Rustam is incidentally, like this gentleman here, a king of Zabul, related to Zabul, of course, Kabul from his maternal side, who happens to wear a bull's head crown. Anyway, that's an aside. Our story takes place in Gandhara, specifically the Kashmir Shmast, which is a cave temple hidden in the Sakra Peak, a 4-hour hike from the nearest village. The Kashmir Shmast, if you look at this map here, this is actually published online. Go to Gandhara, work your way up to Shahbazgari. A little while later, you'll see it's very Kashmir Shmast, which is tragically misspelled here with S-M-A-T-S rather than the other way around. It'll give you a sense of where this is. This is a series of limestone caves artificially expanded over time. Shmast, the word in Pashto, actually means cave. And it's got nothing to do with Kashmir, but according to legend, the innermost recesses of the cave stretch hundreds of miles eastward into the kingdom of Kashmir. Now, the Kashmir Shmast cave temple has been known to be a source of antiquities for well over 100 years. In the 19th century, the Archaeological Survey of India reported it briefly. A few elaborately carved wooden pieces were carried off to the British Museum. But the area was mostly inaccessible as it lay on the fringes of the British Empire. However, in the past, local treasure hunters would make forays into the caves, recovering, however, only the silver and gold coins there, and there were lots of them. Now, the silver and the gold coinage, while interesting, is typical of the region and consists of scarce but mostly well-known specimens that would have circulated around Pakistan, Afghanistan, further into India and Uzbekistan, from the 3rd to the 12th centuries, like the two that I shared earlier on. Ironically, the tiny copper coins from the cave temple were almost entirely ignored, regarded as scrap, so they were just left behind. The actual treasures of this Sakra region were these seemingly unimpressive copper coins, which, unlike any other specimens from the region, were purely local, meant for circulation only within a 5, maximum 10-kilometer radius of the cave. They were the only artifacts that attest to the autonomy of this region through a remarkably long period, unaffected by the various invading armies that swept through. So these coins that are found in a sequence of these 7 actually major shrine sites around the cave temple provide clues into the political, economic, religious, and cultural landscape of the region. The earliest of the specimens actually begin with in the 4th century with a nomadic group called the Kedarites. I don't want to lose you with all of the dynastic names here, but just bear with me. They migrated from Central Asia, and they go on up to the 12th century with the Muslim Ghaznavid dynasty. Now, my story begins in the summer of 2000. When traveling through the region, this local antiquarian and historian asked my assistance in identifying a lot of very unusual coins, which were found in what was then called Pakistan's Northwest Frontier Province. And this lot was made up of hundreds of these tiny little coins. Now, some of these were actually versions of, little versions of well-known regional coins. So you can see the big silver regional coins on the side, and then the little versions that are coming from these sites. But then others featured a host of bizarre images and legends that were completely outside the scope of all publications to date. This is the first coin that I encountered, and this is actually what got me hooked. Why? What's going on here? This unassuming and docile duck carries in its beak the Iranian symbols of royal charisma, Faraizadi, Farailahi, beaded necklace and streamers, which are generally carried by far more elaborate mythical animals, or of course found on as symbols of kingship, actually worn by kings. And here it's a duck. The reverse bears a Sanskrit devotional phrase, Jayati Dharma, roughly meaning the victorious law. In the margins, next to the duck, we find this little symbol that I've actually drawn on the side, sometimes called a lunar bull symbol, which is the royal mark of the much feared White Huns, who ruled this region in the 5th century. And this gives us a chronological marker. We can now date this coin. So this coin, which comfortably blends Iranian, Hunnic, and Indian elements, is the earliest dated depiction of this charisma-bearing duck. And believe it or not, this duck shows up again and again later in Central Asian palace murals. If you've ever been to Samarkand, you will see it. It shows up in metalwork, and then it shows up in textiles and fabrics as far as China. Probing deeper, we were able to trace this and the other coins back to the great cave temple, the Kashmir Shmast. Now, the cave temple itself is a stuff of legend. My first trip was in 2008. We drove to the mountain village Rustam, which is actually named after the legendary hero of the Shahnameh. And from there, we hiked up the mountains for about 3.5 hours. At a certain stage, we encountered an ancient pathway with small meditation cells carved into the side of the rock. And the pathway took us up the mountain, the Sakura Peak. And it splits into three at a certain stage. One path goes to ruins at the top of the peak, one into a valley boasting a well. The water actually of this well allegedly cures tuberculosis, and it is not a far-fetched assumption to think that the healing quality of the well may have something to do with why this site became so important. Now, the third path, which we followed, winds along the side of the cliff to an ancient staircase. You can sort of see the little bit of the ancient staircase on the picture at the bottom, which is on the side of the cliff, and it culminates in the 20-meter high mouth of the Great Cave. Now, the mouth of the Great Cave is at the bottom of this schematic drawing. The cave is naturally believed to be haunted, so we were compelled to offer protective prayers before entering the first great chamber, which extends 60 meters. Near the end of the chamber, we heard the sound of running water, which ascending into the second chamber turned out to be hundreds of bats. So then, of course, we're wading through guano. I didn't bring the right shoes. The staircase ascends eventually to the right, and we reached the last and spectacular chamber, where 30 meters above is an artificial hole in the roof, casting light upon the ruins of two small shrines made from sort of typical Gandharan diaper masonry. This is stuff that you'll find along this whole area. Smaller passages lead downwards into narrower caves, appropriately infested with giant spiders, which I later on found out were not poisonous. Now, over the last 15 years, in a labor of love, I've been working with local farmers, antiquarians, pastoralists, and frantically intercepting coins before they're distributed. I've collected images of about 2,000 specimens from the shrines, with over 300 distinct varieties covering this 700-year period, again, the 4th to about the 12th century. As I said, they feature legends in 5 scripts, unrecorded images, new stylistic elements, and new symbols. Now, based on donation plaques and Chinese travel narratives, we know that the cave temple was in a strategic location. If you happen to be traveling from Kabul, which, as I mentioned, is to the left, right outside of this map, via the Khyber Pass, you get to Purushapura, Peshawar, continue on to this metropolis called Udabhandapura, which is also called Lahore. It's the old city of Lahore, to which the new city actually probably gets its name. One of the biggest cities in the region, and now forgotten. And then you'd sort of head down to Taxila from there. Now, if you happen to be going on this journey, and you wanted to go north to the sacred mountain kingdom of Udayana, which is now called Swat, you would go north towards basically passing a lot of these little shrines. And this, you can see the Kashmir Shmast and then several of the regions around it. The cave temple was the seat of a certain goddess, Bhima Devi, identified as the wife of Shiva. Several other shrines in the region were dedicated to other deities, but the coins produced, as I said, feature a range of Middle Iranian deities, Greek deities, Shaiva and Vaishnava images, and so on and so forth, and also Muslim legends. Xuanzang, a very famous Chinese monk who actually visited the site in the 7th century, tells us that the cave temple featured an idol made from blue stone that was believed to be self-wrought, and that pilgrims visited from faraway countries. There's actually a dedication plaque from someone who visits from the town now called Multan, which hosted a famous sun temple on the Indus River, or near the Indus River. Either way, with 7 days of fasting and meditation, you could actually see a vision of Bhima Devi. Now, this 4th century gold medallion on the book cover may well be a representation of Bhima, or perhaps another local female deity. She shows up again and again on artifacts from the region, including on this tiny coin that you see, which can actually be fairly well dated from the 4th century. And she holds a lotus flower, and as you can see in one hand, and then an ear of grain over her shoulder. And although the portraiture is typically what we call Iranian, following certain Sasanian conventions, the ultimate image recalls the Greek city goddess Tyche and Demeter, which then travels to Gandhara after, of course, Alexander's invasion, and later transforms into the Middle Iranian goddess of wealth called Ardoksho, a demon goddess called Hariti who would occasionally eat children, and later into the Hindu Lakshmi, also the goddess of wealth. The inner scrolling that you can see here around the bust, that is something that appears in Hindu temple doorways of the period. The wreath-like border shows up in Roman medallions. Now, how do these local coins work? What's going on here? Why were they made? So first, it's worth pointing out, again, that the local monetary system of the Sakra region is highly unusual for Central and South Asia and Iran. Nowhere else do we find so many different types of coins being produced for such limited circulation within just a cluster of sacred sites. Now, one of the interventions that this book makes is theorizing a category of votive vernacular coinage. Coinage generally, and I'm saying this broad generalizations to any numismatists who may be here, and who should be down for saying this, serves three purposes as tools for political propaganda, enabling economic acceptance, really something that you recognize as a coin that you're going to want to spend, and in certain cases, representing the civic identity. Now, seen as a collective, as an assemblage, it becomes clear that the Sakra coins, yeah, they do all of these three things, but they really fulfill none of these three functions exclusively. Rather, I posit that they serve a primarily devotional purpose as temple offerings, with pilgrims buying the coins, then offering them at different shrines within the complex. And in this study, I consider how and why images were deployed and the meanings or lack thereof behind the repurposed iconography. Now, in general, when you've got a bimetallic currency system, like say silver and a copper or bronze system, silver coins, which are often struck at official mints, in other words, mints that really are part of an official apparatus, officially sanctioned, these generally facilitate long-distance trade, while copper coinage, generally, like ours, produced by more private mints, sometimes even one-room cottage operations, are primarily meant for local transactions. Now, as I said earlier, the Sakra shrine coinage sometimes follows the patterns of contemporary 2 to 4 gram drachmas or silver coins of regional rulers, but with a twist. The temple moneyers employed dynastic symbols and portraits that you'd find on larger currency, no doubt, sometimes with new eclectic portraits, names, or titles, or symbols. This indicates that while coins were issued independently for use within the Sakra region, the local temple authorities somewhat acknowledged their overlords. There was a functional relationship between this temple mint and what's actually happening in the larger mints, which means that the local temple authorities actually probably had the right of coinage conferred upon them. And this relationship, when you look at the coin, seems to change over time, which is another key concern of this study. How did the local economy and monetary, or I should say sacred economy and monetary system relate to the larger states that govern the region? Where's the state in this story? And the coins give us little hints into shifting hierarchical relationships between the shrine administrations and the greater states. And you find this with shrines across the world, or with shrine states, that there's sort of moments of greater independence, lesser independence, or autonomy. And again, of course, coins only provide hints, and I'm going to go, I'll bring this point home that these coins provide more questions than answers in the end. In some cases, it becomes clear that they were probably importing die engravers in from the big official mints. At other times, you probably have jewelers sitting in the temple complex doing really whatever came to their mind. So why are these coins so important? The main reason is that this sort of 700-year period in which these coins were issued is a veritable dark age in the history of the Iranian borderlands. We have meager sources in the form of scattered Chinese travel accounts and administrative and historical documents, Arabic and Persian chronicles, in which the names of the rulers and the dynasties is sometimes absent, sometimes generic names are used. The kings of Kabul and Gandhara are called Ratbil or Zambil, depending on which source you go to. That seems to be a generic term for all of these kings. Sometimes when the names are there, they're garbled and transliterated beyond recognition. So coins become among the most reliable sources for political history. And this local coinage represents a gold mine in unraveling the numismatic and political history of the period. As more recent finds of coins of late antiquities, particularly coming from Afghanistan, lack any provenance data, it's difficult to assign any variety to any state, polity, or any geography. We just, the coins come out and then they end up in private collections. But with the Sakura copper coins, we actually know generally where they're coming from. We know that whatever inscriptions or images that are found on them were actually circulating in Gandhara and the Kabul Valley. In other words, in northwestern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. So as you can imagine, there are a host of historical questions that this find provides insights into. But since most of them are actually related to really obscure dynasties that I really don't want to lose everyone with, I'm going to mention something a little less obscure. It's an element of the work that addresses some critical assumptions regarding early Muslim-Hindu encounters under the famous Ghaznavid dynasty. And you can see on this map that they really cover a whole chunk of Iran, Central Asia, and deep into South Asia about 1,000 years ago. And these questions actually continue to inform South Asian communalist politics even today. So this addresses a really relevant modern question. For those who aren't familiar, I just put together this rather sort of straightforward slide. For those who are not familiar with the episode, these are kind of the take homes here. Why is this so important? What is this all about? To cut a long story short, the Ghaznavids, about 1,000 years ago, were one of the first great Muslim Persian dynasties. They were based in a city called Ghazna in Afghanistan, and the kings were ethnically Turkish. It's under this dynasty that New Persian develops into a high literary language. It's under their patronage. It's this dynasty that commissions the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, although that story is a little bit problematic. Now, in the beginning of the 11th century, the King Mehmud, this sort of great king, the empire builder, crosses into Gandhara, where a cave temple is located, defeats the local ruling Hindu dynasty, and makes the first lasting conquest of North India by a Muslim ruler. Mahmud's invasion is more than just a random historical moment. It actually ends up being employed as a critical catalyst in James Mill's bifurcation of Indian history into Hindu and Muslim periods. So what does this imply? For British and colonial historians and modern-day South Asians, this was the first clash of Hindu-Muslim civilization, proof of the irreconcilability of two separate peoples and religious traditions. Depending on what side you are on, it's either a great tragedy or the heroic triumph of Islam over Hinduism. Now, popular understandings dictate that this King Mehmud, this empire builder, desecrated temples of India during his campaign as a matter of religious policy, one by one. But the Sakra coins tell a bit of a modified story. So let's start by asking a really simple question. When Mehmud invaded, did he encounter the Sakra sites and the Kashmir Shmast? The short answer is absolutely. He enters via the Khyber Pass to the left of this map, ends up in Purushapura. There's a great battle that happens in this field not far from there, a little bit further on, goes to the town of Ulabandapura, and then enters into the Indus Valley. We know also based on archaeological evidence and certain oral narratives, as well as Persian histories, that he most certainly occupied this kingdom of Swat to the north, which means he must certainly have taken the northward road and encountered and established authority over the Sakra sites. Now, the old chronicles provide vivid descriptions of Mehmud's expeditions against certain key Hindu pilgrimage sites of North India. While such primary sources narrate the destruction of prominent temples, they don't talk about what happened to the vast majority of Hindu and other sacred sites, particularly those in areas that did not directly challenge the sovereignty of the new Muslim rulers. After all, Mehmud even had a Hindu general. Now, consequently, the bulk of scholarship on the Ghaznavids since the British colonial period has assumed that Mehmud's iconoclasm was a matter of policy. This is what he did. It feeds into a certain Muslim exceptionalism argument. And as I mentioned, it's in fact a Muslim and Hindu exceptionalism argument here. And as I mentioned, it's understood that with him, there's this existential clash of civilizations between these two sort of like cultural civilizational systems, quote unquote. Now, the prevailing image of Mehmud as this unwavering iconoclast would suggest that the cave temple and all of the other sites of the Sakra region should have suffered a similar fate as the temples in the Chronicles. But not only have Ghaznavid in later coins been found in the cave temple and its environs, but coins bearing Arabic legends, specifically referring Mahmud and the other Ghaznavid kings, were minted by the temple moneyers in the same manner as the other votive copper issues, in other words, as temple offerings. So this find actually illuminates an aspect of Ghaznavid administrative practices and policies which are pretty much absent in the conquest narratives. Some of the coins feature older motifs of earlier Hindu kings, like this line that you see at the bottom. But on one side, you have now the Muslim declaration of faith. Another type features cosmological symbols with, in fact, a whole sequence of meanings. It's hard to really ascribe a certain meaning to a crescent. But the other side now features Allah. And you can see here, if you sort of use your imagination, how these coins kind of transform. So prior to the Ghaznavid invasion, you have the coin at the top with a kind of funny looking standing figure to the left, if you can make sense of it. And then that particular one is replaced by Allah, but the astrological symbols are retained. Yet other coins actually feature full Quranic formulae and names of the new Muslim kings, but all are actually part of the local cave temple issues. And then there's yet another series coming out at this time with a sequence of what we really call just Hindu devotional motifs. Now, all of this indicates that the temple moneyers produce coins with Arabic inscriptions, and that these coins that we may roughly call Islamic, which is a very problematic term here, were actually being used by Hindu pilgrims. Without going into details, the implications of these finds are substantial, but they need to be nuanced. We can infer that the Ghaznavids incorporated the cave temple into their administrative and revenue-generating apparatus. Perhaps even through a state decree, which may have ensured that, like other political authorities in earlier centuries, that some portion of the revenues of the temple would now be given to the new Muslim-led state. After all, a temple or any religious apparatus is a cash cow. So if you're, happen to be invading it, why would you necessarily want to sort of break down all of the economic infrastructure that actually can produce wealth and centralize wealth? So in other words, Mahmud would have done just like what others would have done in the past who took over the region for the last 500-600 years. Most probably, the Ghaznavids would have supplied die engravers, just as those who came before them, who then worked with the temple artists to include Arabic legends on some of the coins, along with a host of Hindu and Iranian devotional symbols. This indicates that at a critical moment of encounter between this critical moment of the encounter between this Persian Muslim kingdom, Hindu populations, and sacred sites is far more complex than assumed through civilizational clash narratives. And that these coins are a critical piece of material culture that can give us hints to support alternative theories of actually how this relationship may have worked. This is one of many larger historical questions that are illuminated, or I should really say hinted at, through these tiny coins. Ultimately, what we really now require is to bring together historians, numismatists, specialists of Iranian and Hindu theology and ritual, art historians and archaeologists, to try to make sense of these little coins in a broader sense, which far more often pose more questions than they actually answer. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Walid, for that fascinating presentation. I think one of the things that really struck me about this work in this book is really the amount of effort and labor that goes into trying to tell the story about these coins when, the people and the images and the iconography, they're at least historically, temporally so far removed from us, right? So it took me a while to try to understand some of these assumptions that are made about coins and coinage, right? Especially as somebody who's not a numismatist. Like, I am not somebody who studies coins. I think of, coins as something that carries value that you exchange for, some other good, right? That's how I've always interacted with coins. So the more I thought about it, I was trying to understand, like, what is the purpose, the real purpose of these coins? Why would you want a coin to to only circulate in a small part of the world? Why would you only want a coin that could only do one thing? And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized, like, oh, we have plenty of examples like this in the contemporary period, right? We have arcade coins, we have tokens, we have Chuck E. Cheese. Like, not to offend anybody who's actually studies this stuff very seriously, but
No,
we
no,
have,
Chuck E. Cheese coins are legitimate.
but like, you know, where we have coins that are you exchange, you know, maybe silver or gold coins that have value internationally for something local to then provide some sort of expression or performance of value through religious ritual of some sort. So I just want you to kind of, for somebody who's not a, you know, coin expert, which I assume many of us here are not, like, how do you explain the purpose? Like, are we talking about something like the Trevi Fountain where people are throwing coins into, you know, a pond, and that's supposed to bring some sort of religious or ritual purity to yourself? Or is this some sort of good fortune? Like, how would you go about explaining to somebody in the 21st century what it means to have a coin in this sort of religious sphere?
Okay. So yeah, Rustin, you touched upon a whole sequence of issues, right? And first of all, what makes this particular enterprise all the more challenging is the basic historical chronology has not been laid out. Because with the Nizak dynasty, for example, or the Al-Khanahans who come before them, the sources are really, really scattered, and there's a host of different interpretations of the numismatic evidence when you actually match them against the Chinese chronicles, or later on, of course, the Persian and the Arabic chronicles. So a big part of this actually becomes first trying to lay out, you know, what is happening where. What is the political geography of this period, which ends up adding several layers of complexity and layers really of uncertainty to this whole process. So you're asking kind of what these coins, what they do, right? This is, as I mentioned, if we look at this particular case of the Saqqara coins, it is unique in the fact that, you know, you've got the sheer quantity of the coins that comes out, and the fact that you've got this unbroken monetary tradition that lasts about 700 years at the very least. But we do have several other examples around the world that can give us several clues. And this is, of course, in lieu of the, let's say, the correct written evidence to understand how ritual may have actually worked in this place. So these can give us hints. And there are a couple of examples that actually come to mind from Jerusalem. So you have one biblical example from the Temple of Jerusalem where pilgrims visiting required certain acceptable currency, and because of certain biblical prohibitions against the use of graven images of foreign rulers, there were certain particular shekels, I think, of Tyre that were used that could only be used on that sacred mount. Much later in Jerusalem, also under the Crusaders, in the very same area, you have these coins that are issued, which actually feature a rather crude image of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was believed to be the Temple of Solomon, and an Arabic legend that more or less indicates a holy place that were also meant for the sacred sanctuary. We even have a similar case that shows up in Mecca, which under the Rasulullah dynasty of Yemen, where you have a sequence of coins that are minted specifically for use within a sacred precinct. And frankly, we don't have to go very far. In the US, which is really part of an older European tradition, we have communion tokens for the Lord's Supper, which you sort of bring to church, and then you take part in certain rituals. Now, I'm giving you these faraway examples, but there's actually an example a little closer to home, home being this cave temple site, which actually may give us a sense of what's going on here. In fact, this example I'm giving you, which is the example of something called the Ramatanka, may actually even have been inspired by the tradition that we see at play in the Saqqara sites. So there are these coins called Ramatankas that are about yay big generally, and they begin in about the 10th century, but they really don't kick in until the 19th and 20th centuries, where it's sort of this thing really, really flourishes. So there are these tokens showing scenes from the Ramayana, and they were probably initially issued by temple authorities, later by jewelers or silversmiths. You can still see silversmiths that are producing these. And they were sold generally in bazaars within temple complexes. these coins were actually meant for ritual worship. They were either kept at temples or actually there's a source in the 19th century that mentions, or in the house of Vaishnava Brahmins for household worship. So in a nutshell, when you are performing the ritual in front of the idols, offering, let's say, milk, curds, ghee, etc. to the idol, you then pour water on it, and then after that, you'd shower it with these coins, these special sanctified coins. One tradition dictates that actually they were only kept within the holy sanctuaries. They couldn't even leave, and only handled by priests. Now, what's interesting in the Ramatanka case is that even in the 19th century, the iconography changes and gets a little bit quirky. So you've got certain, let's say, something held by Vishnu, which gets replaced with a sword. And this is kind of at random, based on the whim of whoever is actually producing this. Ganesh and Shiva would show up in these. Later, they even featured Sikh and Muslim imagery. And again, it's really what the Manier, who was asked to actually produce these, came up with. So in our case, we would assume, and there could be a lot of debate about this, these are, of course, we only have indications, that these coins would have been minted within the sacred complex as a guarantee of ritual purity. The worshippers come in, they bring in whatever gold and silver and then, or maybe copper, and then they purchase these, probably handfuls of these, which then they present to the pujari, and who may then have showered the idols with them, or then donated them to the temple, or maybe provided them as offerings. It's also possible that, and certainly scholars of Hinduism and Hindu ritual would be able to shed light on this, especially in this early sort of formative years, that if they were indeed sacramental, they may not actually have been allowed to be used in other economic transactions. So in other words, these are specifically items that were to be used for a ritual purpose. You know, when I was talking about the iconography of these coins, that actually sheds quite a bit of light on why I actually argue that these are not necessarily the type of coins that are used for political propaganda or for the purposes of ensuring day-to-day transactions in the bazaars, or certainly for proclaiming some sort of political or religious identity.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Those examples. I think it really helps us think through what these coins were used for, and how, giving other examples across time and space for that, where we have analogies to how these coins were used. I am cognizant of time, so I will let our audience know that we will be going a little bit over to answer some of your questions, and I appreciate everybody for putting their questions in the Q&A. For the sake of making sure we get to everybody, I do have two questions that I want to kind of briefly ask, and then we will turn over to the questions in the Q&A. And it's really about the iconography and the materiality of the coins. Yeah. And obviously, a huge part of this book is about, trying to delineate what these iconographic choices are, how they came to be, this amalgamation of different iconographic styles and traditions. And so once again, I know it's difficult to answer the question of how are these coins received? What are the reception? How were these motifs included? How did they change? But if you could just think about in a ritual space, in a religious space, what did these coins, like, how can you help us think through the iconographic choices? Yeah. Sitting here in 2021, of somebody putting a coin, the face of a ruler with the Fari Zadi, or like, what are these different iconographic choices doing?
The short answer is we don't know, and we should not pretend to know. Like, this is not part of what this book actually does. I would say one of the theoretical interventions, which is ongoing debates within numismatic and actually all broader sort of circles of people working on iconography, is really how to make sense of iconographic choices. Like, simply put, In fact, what I actually do is I delineate certain categories of iconography to basically help us begin to explain what may be going on here. Simply put, when it comes to religious iconography, we can't simply take a dollar bill and see the little pyramid with the eye on it and assume that everyone using it is ascribes to some ancient Egyptian faith. That simply, it's absurd. It makes no sense. So within actually the introduction to this book, I delineate a whole sequence of categories of iconography, be it like, let's say, royal or religious iconography. And of course, there's really a fine dividing line between the two. And arguing that to interpret these coins to any degree of success, we have to be cognizant of which category each piece of iconography fits in. And we also have to be aware of the context in which this iconography shows up. In other words, we have to be aware more or less of all circulating coins in the region. What type of images were showing up in seals? What was actually happening with regards to temple statuary? Because without that, we cannot understand like what a very particular symbol is doing. And I'll give you an example here. So one of the categories that I delineate is something called deliberate devotional. So here you may have a specific motif. Let's say that there is, a coin is based on some older Iranian Sasanian model, which very often happens, but then the reverse has, let's say, an image of Vishnu's conch, or let's say a swastika, or a Pegasus shows up, and a Pegasus is not something that's really showing up very commonly on coins of any neighboring region. Or when we have, for example, that Allah in a circle. Allah in a circle is not a legend that actually shows up. So all of these are done very deliberately. And Allah in a circle probably means that this is a shout out to Allah as a deity, right? It's not just randomly copying a word or design that shows up on other coins. Now, beyond that, of course, it may be deliberate devotional, but then we can delineate that into categories as well of certain haphazard ones or something that is actually more closely connected to a shrine. Then there's another category, which is formulaic. So you remember that slide where I had the 4 fire altars, right? Now, under no circumstances can we take those fire altars and assume that we're talking about people following the Zoroastrian faith. Because what's happening here in the longue durée, and anyone familiar with coins in the region can attest to this, is you've got a certain model of coinage that comes up under the Sasanians. Actually, it's a little bit earlier, but it really comes to the fore under the Sasanians with a fire altar on the reverse. And then a whole sequence of coins, literally over up to the 11th and to the 12th, even 13th century, will be vague copies of that coin with the head of a Sasanian ruler on one side and the fire altar on the other, despite the fact that Zoroastrianism is long gone. So the fire altar literally becomes a marker of currency. It becomes like, so when you see the fire altar, it means coin. So one has to be very careful in actually interpreting something that may actually simply be formulaic. Another category that I talked about is artistic. There's another image that I had shared of a silver coin of this Indo-Greek king Menander. It's a rather beautifully created coin, again, about 160 BC or thereabouts. And he ruled over this region really from Central Asia all the way down into Kantara. So his coins are readily found there. And then all of a sudden, from within the sites, you find these rather crude copper copies of these coins of Menander, and this is happening 450, 500 years after the fact. So what's happening here is this is not a shout out to Menander as a legitimate sovereign here. This is most probably someone who finds a coin of Menander as they're digging under the soil, which would be very common, finds it to be actually artistically very pleasing, and then decides, well, I'm going to recreate this thing because it'll go well in this like rather eclectic array of tokens that I'm producing. So in the end, it's I'd have to say that throughout all of this, as I said before, this poses a lot more questions. Any one of these given specimens can be the subject of a lot of debate, whether symbols should be taken at face value, whether they should be interpreted otherwise. Can these coins of the Ghaznavids necessarily be interpreted as tolerance? I mean, should we even use that kind of term? Or is it much more that we're talking about consistency in like in a coin minting apparatus, which of course has its own a story to tell, but we have to be very careful about where we put the bounds of the kind of conclusions that we can draw from something like this.
Of course. Thank you. So my next question, I'm going to actually combine it with a few questions in the Q&A. John and Matthew ask, where would the metals for this coinage most likely be sourced? And that leads to my question is, why copper? Why were they using copper? So if you can answer those two questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually do not know where the nearest copper mines are at this stage. There's, I guess, the nearest silver mines, where the big silver mines are sort of north of the Kabul Valley. These are the well-known ones. I mean, copper is circulating back and forth within these routes. There is a very, very strong tradition of actually transporting copper. I'm going to mention an example, which is really, it's historically very, very far away, but it's a much more well-documented example of, let's say, in the Mughal Empire, where you'd have certain cities where copper coinage was sourced from. And at certain times you would have mints at the source, but a lot of time you would actually transport that copper into other areas then to be reused. So it's it could be a combination of already circulating copper as well as copper that's actually being imported in. Keep in mind here that although the Cave Temple does seem to be in a little bit of it's both on a route and off a route, because there's obviously something about that mountain highland area, which up till really the 19th century, and one can even argue actually until the last couple of decades, to about 7-8 years ago, it can exercise a fair amount of autonomy because of the actual space. It's a defensible space. It's a little bit off of the main highways, but it's still on major highways. So in fact, one could assume that there is some sort of commodity trade that is taking place at that site, which does actually happen. I mean, you've got a very famous case of a horse trade in the North Indian temple, and so on and so forth, trade fairs that are happening in which commodities like the copper could also be brought in and traded.
Wonderful, thank you. I do want to bring out a comment that I think would be really interesting for everybody in the audience. And this is from John Dale. And John says, even today at some India temples, it is the custom for visitors to use real money to buy small value local non-circulating copper coins, particular to the temple site, from small scale money changers. These in turn are used to distribute alms to beggars lining the approach to the temple, as well as to make offerings to the presiding priests. Thus, a small budget of real money can be stretched to make a larger number of modest offerings. Within the temple complex, these non-circulating local coins are later sold in bulk back to money changers for real cash. So maybe this is a contemporary analogy to some of the coinage, the economy of the coinage that we're seeing, but I don't want to speculate, but I did think that was an interesting comment, and I wanted to share with everyone.
John, that's exactly what I'm talking about here, and in fact, it would be a lot of fun to discuss this with you in the future, because there are, I think, a fair number of modern day analogies that can be used. I'm actually really struck by this, that when I was spending quite a bit of time in Sindh in the last, let's say, 2-3 years, how much of the specific iconography that shows up in the Sakra sites is actually showing up on these tokens that are issued by silver tokens, very, very thin bracteate silver tokens that are issued by jewelers and available in the bazaars in Sindh, which are then sort of distributed to families and used as donations to temples. So sort of they have this dual function. Yeah, I would absolutely agree, and I think this is something that more and more can be explored. In fact, once we sort of engage a sort of broader group of people who actually can even opine on the way in which ritual was transforming at this, this critical 4th century when all of this takes off. It is interesting. Copper is of course being used because it's cheap, right? So presumably, if you bring in 1 drachma, you're going to get a silver drachma. You're going to get a host of copper coins that you can then donate. And then there's something else very specific about copper, and this is alluding, Rustin, to your last comment here, that that there is generally a lot more freedom with copper when it comes to mints. As I was mentioning earlier, silver mints and gold mints are often we don't have very much evidence for the, let's say, the 1st century, but we start hearing about this in more of the Persian sources by about the 13th century or so, that the way in which gold and silver become the prerogative of the state, these actually become state-run enterprises, but with copper, it's really not worthwhile to do that. So you'll have very kind of almost mutable relationships between the central state and what's going on in these particular copper mints. There is a lot more freedom to experiment when it comes to copper. There's a lot less oversight.
Thank you. So the next 2 questions are about iconography and how they end up on these coins, right? So Bilal asks, did the investigation of the caves artifacts offer any insight into how cultures displayed on the coins may have interacted in terms of trade and exchange of currency? So I guess this is more of like a global trade question.
Yeah.
And then Marcus's question, are coins ever modified by subsequent rulers or authorities? For example, might a new king stamp over existing coinage with his own mark? Could this make it difficult to determine whether there are actually mixing of these beliefs or whether it was just the coin being reused?
Yeah, both excellent questions. So a quick answer to the first one. We get a certain sense of the circulating iconography based on the seals that are found there. And it really appears that the temple statuary may less have informed what is happening. And of course, we can't just necessarily say one thing's informing another, right? It's cyclical. Coins inform seals, inform statuary. We see this in actually a couple of centuries earlier in the Kushan case, where we have a very interesting relationship that's written about by a colleague of mine as to how representations of the Buddha actually show up, sculptural informing coinage and vice versa. In this case, there are certainly some images, and I'm thinking, for example, or incarnation of Vishnu, which show up on these coins that really do not have any sigillographic or numismatic sort of coin or seal forebears. That there's definitely some relationship with the type of idols that would have been circulating, and that is both those that would have been permanent and those actually also which would have presumably been circulating. In terms of the actual statuary from the region, we have very little evidence, and we have there's one or two rather well-known statues of Vishnu. We have several linga which are coming out of this site, but that's an area where it's a bit of a gray area for us right now. But with regards to seals, you can actually see a constant and really fascinating kind of dialectic of the way in which certain old coins and seals are used and then repurposed in certain ways, sometimes hundreds of years later. In like literally something I'm thinking that is a 4th century coin that reappears in the 10th century. In a slightly, that image probably goes through a seal and then that kind of is found and then repurposed in a very different artistic style. So this seems to be generally what's happening. Also, in terms of the circulating artifacts, I mean, there have been Tang period Chinese currency that's found there. There are reports of Sogdian currency, although I've actually never seen it myself. And beyond that, a whole host of currency, really, from the Guptas in North India, really all the way to Sasanian currency and beyond. We have, in fact, this is a broader Gandharan phenomenon of token currency. This is like really, really paper thin gold or sometimes even clay token currency, which is imitating Byzantine and Roman prototypes. So these coins are actually flowing in via the proverbial Silk Road and are actually part and parcel of the iconographic melange. The second question was about the reusing. Yes, all the time. We have to be very careful that when we find the introduction of new motifs in a particular coin that is not necessarily, or a new coin type, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a political shift that's happening, because there's a gradual change. It takes time to actually shift from one coin to another. And to fill in those gaps, occasionally there's something called countermarking, where you literally actually countermark the coin with like a tiny little mark that may be, let's say, a royal mark or a bust or a legend or so on and so forth. beyond that, you can also tamper with the dies. So you tamper with the coin dies and you add another symbol in there, like there's and then that actually represents a different sovereign. And this, as you can imagine, in fact, actually the last point I should make here, which is even more problematic, is that most dynasties in this region were not exclusive in terms of, let's say, like the Safavids and the Mughals that are far better known, that they would have minted all the old coins each time a king passed away and had a new sequence of coins minted, even devalued those that actually came before. There's much more leniency here. We find coin hoards that actually will span coins stretching 600 years. So when one new dynasty comes in, they don't necessarily wipe out the coins of the previous dynasty because of the propagandic value of those coins.
Excellent. The next two questions are about the end of the shrine complex.
Yeah.
So John asks, why did the Kashmir Shmast fall out of use as a pilgrimage site, and when and why? And did it last until the colonial period? And then Hunter asks, how has the site changed due to political, economic, and even climatic factors? What other efforts are being made to preserve or study this site?
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, both important questions. I honestly wish I knew the answer, the exact answer to the first one. And I think it's not clear. There do seem to have been certain, at least there have been two actually seasons of excavations there, and this is a question really for the archaeologists as to what may have happened to the site. The answer, actually, from my perspective, looking at not just this site but several other sites in the region, is that these sites they gradually fall out of favor due to, let's say, the changing of trade routes, or of course climatic factors. But by and large, a site like the Kashmir Shmast or like the Saqqara sites transform. And they are, one can even argue that up till recently, these sites are actually very important. So in the case of the Saqqara sites, there's actually there's a shrine for the Sikri Baba. It's a Muslim shrine that actually exists very close to there. So the cave temple itself, it's a little bit difficult to get to, so I'm not sure exactly when it would have fallen out of favor. The latest coins that we actually find in the site, and this is based on an earlier publication, I think we're about 14th century or so, so into the sort of Mongol invasion, Delhi Sultanate period. But in some form or another, these sites actually persist, and they sort of transform over time. And Rustin, you will recall I was mentioning the site of where this demon goddess Hariti met Lord Buddha, which is located in Charsadda, a few hours away from there. And it's really fascinating that this is a site dedicated to a female goddess who at first is rather notorious for eating children, and then Lord Buddha tells her not to do that, so she changes her ways. And then the temple of where the two of them met becomes a site where historically, in the ancient period, people would take their children for to be cured. It was basically a place associated with childbirth and with sort of early childhood cures to certain ailments. And I just visited actually this last summer, and it's quite remarkable that where that temple stood, really at the base of that temple, is now a Muslim shrine to a female saint called Bibi Sayyada. And guess what happens there? People take their children there for similar cures. So over the period of time, these sites just transform. So part of it will probably also have to be the slow process of conversion and the way in which these sites get renegotiated.
Wonderful, fascinating. I do want to piggyback off of Carl's question. So Carl's question is, what are the implications of your research for possibly revising the picture of the Arab invasions of the Indus Valley as depicted in the Chashnama? And also the question that I have is, what does this research and your book do in terms of our understanding of Persianate and Iranian studies?
Okay, the first one I'll have to think about, because it's a parallel trajectory, right? The first invasions of Zamindawar, of the Ghazni and Kabul, the sort of sites and then actually moving really onto the Indus River, happened under the period of the Caliph Uthman. And in fact, they claim to happen even earlier, but these are generally the first recorded ones. So we're talking about, I mean, the first invasions into this area are actually quite different. They're happening under, of course, very different circumstances. And they're obviously very, very different campaigns. There's something rather interesting that's happening in the case of, and I really, I hesitate to draw parallels to what's happening today, and I'm so tempted to do it, but it's really irresponsible to do it. But there's something about the structure of the Nizak state, the late Nizak state and the Turkshahi state, which makes it notoriously difficult to actually hold these regions. And what ends up happening is that you've got the setting up of the Arab garrison at Zaranj in Sistan. And that becomes where literally, as I said, for about 160, 170 years, you've got consistent campaigns to try to take the Kabul Valley and deeper, and they're never successful. So, I mean, I guess one can really opine about the structure of the state and what allows, for example, Muhammad ibn Qasim or Muhammad ibn Harun in the case of Makran, to basically secure this region in a matter of years, all the way up the Indus, and then what makes it so difficult for an army, for example, to secure this region. And part of it, of course, may just be a kind of a hybrid pastoral nomadic and urban system, which allows for a lot of mobility, a lot of flexibility, and of course, I mean, if this is indeed one of the regions that produces a figure like Rustam, we are talking about again, I think a historian of warfare will be able to say this much better than myself, but we are talking about probably cavalry-based units that are just much more efficient and holding off whatever technology was coming in the sequence of campaigns coming in from Zaranj. So I'll have to think about that, Carl. It's not an obvious question as to what this really says about the Chachnameh narrative. Numismatically, there are a lot of parallels. We actually see something very similar happening of hybrid coins, the way that symbols actually enter into the Muslim equation. I'm doing this work right now on the four-petaled lotus, which is this ancient symbol that becomes very important, shows up on Buddhist stupas in the Indus Valley, later on in temple thresholds and doorways, and then becomes this ubiquitous symbol all across the Muslim base metal coinage system. In fact, it is certainly a sacred symbol, Islamic sacred symbol. So we do see that kind of melange that is happening in both of these cases from a coinage vantage point. The other question, Rasin, you were mentioning about how this displaces the Persianate, and there are, it certainly does, and there are several ways that I think it does this. First and foremost is that certain iconography that we assume to be Iranian, right? This is a broader world that's actually creating a whole sequence of iconography that does not necessarily move west to east. I talked about the bird, right? That little duck. And that duck is generally referred to as Sasanian iconography because it becomes so ubiquitous later on in Sogdian metalwork. I challenge anyone to find an actual Sasanian version of that because it really seems to be coming of age under the White Huns in Gandhara in the form of, in fact, sculptural form as well as numismatic form. So on one hand, we need to sort of figure out a lot of the iconography, a lot of the symbols that we call Iranian symbols to sort of, it sort of recenters a lot of this, right? A lot of the, so I was mentioning the representations of the Holy Fire, the way that they are, because of the legacy of the Kushans, which was extremely ecumenical and very, very tolerant towards other faiths, we see a very, the cults of, for example, Mithra, the Nanai, Mao, moon god, sun god, all of these sorts of Middle Iranian cults that really, really appear in this region, right? This is really where they are coming to the fore, and then also presumably being given some form of royal or at least elite patronage, where they can actually become these cults within their own terms. But the study also actually forces us to rethink this region as a whole. You know, I keep talking in this whole period, I talk about transculturation and cultural mixing, and the whole time there's a voice inside my head which says, like, Walid, what are you talking about? This is rubbish. Because transculturation actually, although I shamelessly use it throughout this lecture and in the book, really posits, obviously, an essential, you know, Turkic, let's say Central Asian, an essential Indian, an essential Persian, right? And then this zone becomes a zone of like this obscure, bizarre, rather interesting transculturation and mixing. But the reality, of course, is that every zone is a contact zone. And this is happening in every single zone. And if you start looking at Sasanian coinage and looking at what inspired it, you're going to see, obviously, the core Sasanian lands as that same contact zone. So what this actually is also asking us to do is to really recenter a little bit, and to look at this zone. In fact, it's a large zone which is treated like this, and I would argue it is what is today Afghanistan, much of Pakistan, with the exception of Punjab, and a chunk of Central Asia, that are put into in-between spaces where cultural mixing happens. We look at them from the vantage point of other cultures, right? And the reason why we look at them like that has everything to do with actually 19th century great game politics and the colonial academic enterprise that comes out of it. That there are certain places that are seen to actually embody the sort of these originary and like pure cultures, and then everything between sort of falls in this netherworld, which we have to explain otherwise. But you know, it is worth pointing out that the Kushan Empire, that was really phased out right before this cave temple really comes into effect, is you know, may well be the richest kingdom that the world has at the time. So, and certainly, you know, actually, it's really the parallel to Rome, right? And so there is a lot that's happening there. And its capital cities are Balkh in northern Afghanistan, and then, I mean, of course, there are several, Kapisa as well, and then eventually Peshawar in northwestern Pakistan, that are now, should possibly be seen as centers rather than necessarily these in-between spaces, or even the terminology that I was using of the frontiers, or these sort of contact zones.
Wonderful. So I will. I think it is time for us to end, but before I do and hand it over back to Mehdi, I do want to bring in two more questions. And those questions are, one is a little bit more fun, which is, if you could create your own coin, what would you want on it?
Oh, man.
And then the other is from Babak, who asks, do you collaborate with Touraj Daryai on your work at all?
The latter question, I'll say I would love to. There's so much need for collaboration in this. You know, there's I'm just talking about the iconographic side of it. The heavier side of this is the heavier lifting actually becomes literally the political histories here, and delineating, you know, who's got what at what time. And there are you know, all of these. There's a whole sort of array of sources, an array of approaches that really needs to start communicating a lot more. And I think the worlds of let's say these really problematic worlds of Central Asian studies and South Asian studies, and Iranian studies need to start collaborating a lot more in order to actually understand what's going on, and in order to even see the way in which certain sort of transregional assumptions can be broken down. Yeah, my own coin. I really don't know where to begin on this question. All I can say is that presumably anything that I would come up with would probably have been done in the Sakra sites, because it's just really, I think they leave no stone unturned as to how to actually bring different things together. But I'm going to have to take a rain check on that last question, because it's obviously something very important and has to be considered
Seriously.
maturely and seriously.
Well, thank you so much for our audience. Thank you for joining us. That was Dr. Walid Ziad, and his book is in the treasure room of the Sakra King, which is published by the American Numismatic Society, which will be out in February. So I'll hand it over to Mehdi, but thank you all for your patience, and thank you for letting us go over a little bit more over time.
It was an excellent panel. I personally enjoyed it. Thank you all for participation. And please remember that we will be back with another diaspora panel discussion with the author Shahryar Mandanipur. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week and great holidays.